we're here with Lisa Wong and Amit Tishler of Binary Bubbles, CEO and biz dev guy. They have a great story to tell about how they confronted fundamental business problems for mixed reality as an indie, and how they've made a success of their studio. As many businesses of size relate, we often have to face some really hard situations and find a way to survive challenging marketing conditions and then to thrive in that. So hi Amit, hi Lisa. Thank you so much for being here at the Business of Indie Games Summit. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you.
Nice, thanks for having us.
When you first started out with Binary Bubbles, what was the original aim for your studio?
Originally, we wanted to create original IP that was persistent across all media. So we were actually hitting the transmedia space. So Amit's background is in television, and mine is in games, and our CTO's is also in games. And so we thought, you know, TV shows and games should exist in the same universe, and they should affect each other in creative ways. So that's actually what we started out to do. And we were in a development studio. We created original content. We took and worked for hire, and our goal was to do that to fund our own projects and sell it to publishers and networks.
How did you find that? I mean, that sounds like a plan, right?
Yeah.
That sounds like mixing, smart TV. I imagine you're talking about smart TV plus console, making unique products that go, seamlessly across all platforms, playable individually on those platforms. Yeah.
Yeah. So because Amit's background was in television development and television production, specifically in animation, we kind of saw that as an advantage, right? Because it's access to that network and what they were looking for. That's a really specific business, and that business was always looking to, how to make their content more interactive, and we can definitely see that happening now, right? It's been going on for a few years. So he and I met while working at another indie studio. And I and my CTO actually met while working at another indie studio. And Amit actually suggested we should create an original IP that we could actually pitch to television networks. So we did that, and we got it optioned. So we had ended up selling a full script and a game design.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And yeah, that's where we thought, okay, this is great. This is sort of where our business should be headed. And we formed Binary Bubbles.
Right. And we got, the network essentially paid for the first milestone for the game. So they actually kind of put their contract into practice. And I think the first project we've ever taken on was a pretty high profile one. We were essentially the lead developer on Spider-Man Homecoming VR for Sony Pictures and Create. So off to a pretty promising start as far as getting a big push in.
Yeah, in VR.
Yeah.
How did you get such a good break, straight away without a track record?
Where Amit and I met and our CTO met is actually my CTO and I, Richard, we worked on the Ghostbusters VR experience together for PlayStation, right? So same company with Create and Sony Pictures, right? And Richard and I were brought in with this other indie studio to essentially do the engineering and art tech, right? So when Richard and I and Amit formed Binary Bubbles, Create decided to use us to do their next VR project.
And so what happened? I mean, Spider-Man, what a great license to attach to a VR product. How did it go? I mean, how did you find that? I mean, I understand that the VR market is very difficult, that, there's not a lot of content out there. There's not yet the uptake from the public, and there's a lot of money being put into it so far, but without, meaningful results.
The people who are getting these contracts are honestly generally not developers. They're not the people we expect to. And lots of times, especially with the Hollywood, like this is the Spider-Man and the Ghostbusters thing, that was a straight up marketing budget product, right? So that wasn't a standard game development. It didn't go through the game studios. So it really was about having a connection into that market. And that's not the development market. That's the Hollywood market.
Yeah, because in the end, we were
Yeah, I
brought
see.
in essentially the developers to do all the heavy lifting on engineering and on UX and on VFX, because the company who actually took the project,
That's
they
what
were
they
not
do.
a developer.
Yeah.
As simple as that. So they, you know, the way development studios that act as third parties are often labeled are as essentially black boxes. You're not exactly hidden, but the level of involvement of the work you actually do is not necessarily known to the customer.
You're not usually front facing, right? So the main sort of ad agency essentially takes the contract, right? And then they try and find people to do it. They find people like us.
Correct. And as far as the big network project that we sold, I've had the relationship with the network going on for years at that point. I've ran my business before. I worked as an animator in the Hollywood space for a while. So I had my own reputation and, you know, just history with them. So when I came in as part of, you know, a new business, because I started working in business development in games, and I said, look at what we have, they were already comfortable with me, and bringing in another, you know, experienced development team essentially brought in a lot of gravity. So they were comfortable with that. They were like, okay, we know you. These guys seem to know their shit. Let's move forward.
It was very much like that for us when we first started out. You know, we were doing contracts for marketing and ad agencies, and we'd be invisible in the background until we were able to generate a game that could actually be released on a platform to the public, you know, and we were fortunate enough to release something on PlayStation 1 quite early on. And also on PC, you know, which is a fair game for everybody. So the VR marketing piece, did many people even get to see that? I mean, it wasn't obviously released as a sort of saleable product to the public, right?
Yeah, it was the Spider-Man thing was free. So
Yeah, it's out there.
yeah, so when it was tied in with the movie, right? So it was straight up marketing. They had the celebrity voices, and it was supposed to be short, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
We had to essentially, even though we are credited in it, we had to really aggressively own our part. Nobody else would do the marketing for you. If it's up to the advertising studio, in all honesty, they would try to bury you as far as possible. But we were very aggressive in reaching out to the actual studio so they know who we are. And now they really do. And let me tell you, that helps in the long run.
yeah,
Right?
Yeah, of course,
you have
yeah.
to do your PR,
Yeah.
right?
Especially in cases like that, because the expectation that the client that essentially hired you to do will voluntarily tell people that they used you, not very likely. So you have to be very, very aggressive in getting out there and saying, like, we worked on this and this is how much we actually did on this.
Yeah, this is what we're responsible for. I think one of the things too, and this is where, you know, I want to acknowledge Amit's network as well, which is this allowed us to get a lot of coverage, right? Because my network is in games. I could obviously talk to my people in games and say, like, of course we did this. And game people would understand that, right? They kind of know what it takes to do things. But his network in Hollywood, they don't know how we do things, right? So already knowing Amit for several years, you know, he had the credibility there. He could sort of sit there and say, here's the rest of my team, right? And this is what they do. And then that would be our entree to basically show our portfolio, right? We could come in and we just said, this is all the stuff we're able to do.
Yeah. And in all honesty, what ended up happening that was kind of gratifying, if we're honest, is that the client itself kind of complained to us, and they were like, we're walking into the studios and they're telling us, like, oh, you guys worked with Binary Bubbles. They got really pissed off. But in all honesty, well, okay, we never hid the fact that we actually worked for them. We were always upfront and always honest about it. But the truth of the matter is, they couldn't hide us, and that was very frustrating for them. And I think this is a good lesson in general to anybody who's coming into this space. People need to understand that your network and your ability to leverage it in a very aggressive way, your marketing is absolutely crucial to your success. It's something that people tend to question. And I come from an artistic background, right? I've been an animator for most of my life. So I know the artiste kind of thinking of, I'm just going to do something good. I'm going to tell people, I'm going to put it out there. I am a cynic, but I will also be dead honest. No one cares. No one cares. You have to be very upfront and you have to be very aggressive and you have to pull any string that you have in order to start gaining traction and leverage because nobody else will do it for you. It's very hard to cut through the noise and very easy to just fade into the distance.
Yeah, one of the things I kind of, it's a joke that's not really a joke, which is sometimes it's very unfortunate that lots of times the things that made you want to create games, that turned you into an engineer or an artist, is not an extroverted type of personality, right? Right? And that's been a hurdle. Like honestly, like I think definitely Amit's background and the business that he came from, it is all about being front facing, right? And the hustle is part of the job, right? Whether or not you like it, the hustle is part of the job. People make fun of Hollywood for that, right? But that is something they know how to do. And I think and you know, I like this about our business. I think because in many ways the grounding of our business is engineering. It's fairly binary, right? Does it work? No. Well, then fix it, right? Like you can't lie about that, right? Or you feel like you can't. Obviously, people lie, but you know,
the programmers will try.
Yeah, you know. I have so many stories about, I'm like, does that really not work or do you not feel like doing it? Because I think those are two different things. but like, but you know, in the general, you know, you're working with hardware and there's sort of a solidity to what you're working with. And Hollywood product fundamentally is subjective, right? And it is about networking. I mean, we were able to secure our first original IP deal through a network because it came together fast enough that we needed an agent, right? And we had the good fortune that Amit had one, right? So we were able to approach her and say, hey, we actually have a deal on the table. Will you negotiate it for us? And of course she said yes, because you already have a deal. But
and can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I imagine, of course, the Spider-Man marketing gig wouldn't have delivered any royalties. So then you're immediately at the risk as you're as good as your next contract, right?
Yes. Yeah,
and so what and it sounds great. I mean, it's fantastic you got the front facing side. Is that really, I suppose, you know, a biz dev guy for me is vital, because they're that bridge between the programmer and the artist and the customer, you know, the publisher. And somebody needs to be able to speak both languages, you know.
Yeah, and be willing to go out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so is that your role, Amit? Is that you fulfill that business development? Or I suppose the pair of you do the road show together now, right?
Absolutely. Like me and Lisa essentially represent the company for the most part. Sometimes it's just me, but especially now that we've kind of pivoted a little more into technology, having the CEO be front-facing is incredibly important. But usually we go out there together. A lot of the initial contacts and reach outs just to get people engaged, I usually do alone, and then we kind of loop Lisa in and we present together. To answer your question regarding like you're only as good as your next contract, I think that is a really important point to kind of take a moment on, because one of the most difficult things that indies have to face right now, if they do rely on any work for hire contract in order to go on, they need to realize a few, let's say, big traps along the way. And I've definitely noticed under other independent developers really underestimating the impact of terminology, of negotiation, of just what you're saying, what you're asking, and the lack of listening to what the customer's actual concerns are. Because the thought is always, we're coming in, we're experienced, we know what we're doing, why wouldn't you give it to us, right? But putting yourself in the shoes of your customer or the publisher that you're appealing to is unbelievably critical. So I'll give you a few examples, like, and this is a change in the market that has happened over time. Like, publishers were more used to, if you're a studio, it doesn't really matter whether you're a remote studio, whether you have location and you can scale up. They were a little more open to both formats. That is no longer the case. And when we started the business, one of the first moves that we immediately hopped onto is like, we have to actually open a location. We have to have an office. We have to have a place that can host customers coming in. And that was unbelievably helpful because when I was doing business development for another studio, the CEO actually said in a meeting, "Oh no, we're a remote studio and we do management." And at that moment, I just turned white, right? But at that moment, I realized, no, you just told the studio, we will never hire you again. And some studios have actually said that out loud. Like, they said it up front, "Oh, we've had a bad experience with this. We no longer use it. We prefer studios that are established and already have staff." So knowing what those traps are and what the pain points are is really, really critical.
Yeah, you have to listen to what the publisher is actually telling you about how they run their business.
Absolutely.
Because the truth, right? They have the power, you don't, right? If they decide, there's plenty of other, right now, no matter how much you love your project, they don't know you, they don't know your project. And if they see like 100 of them in one conference, right? Everyone wants, it's one of the frustrating things, right? You know that inherently what makes something successful, why something has traction, it is subjective. But everyone on the side that's holding the money, they want to believe it's as much of a science as they can.
Yeah.
Right? So they look for like just certain things like, oh, are you XYZ? If you're not, you don't even make that first cut.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it's really about lowering the risk to the point where there is no risk, but it's unrealistic because there always is. Now, another problem that is created is that they want to lower the risk by only taking studios that are more established and big. So any independent developer that's new, that's going to be a challenge right off the bat. But the problem that everybody's already aware of is the fact that outsourcing studios, in the East specifically, are so much cheaper. And we're talking about...
It's like 1/10.
Yeah, like 70%
right?
cheaper at the very least. To the point where even if, and this actually happened to us with a very big customer that came in, and we're talking about a company that can spend money like crazy. But they essentially said, we got burnt by this studio in China multiple times, right? They dropped the ball.
But they were so cheap.
But they were so cheap.
Yeah.
Can you guys give us something that kind of matches and take this budget into consideration? They were terrified. They actually got Google, like they came to Google to say like, hey, can you recommend us developers who actually know their shit? Because we need somebody to save our asses, right? That was flat out what they did. And Google recommended us, which is a very, very nice little, fist bump. But what ended up happening in the end of the day, they ended up picking the cheap studio, regardless of knowing it's going to be a disaster. And by the way, not a good result. They got exactly what they paid for. But they still made that choice, knowing that it wasn't the right one, just because it was cheaper. And we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars cheaper. It comes down to nickel and diming.
Yeah, they literally, they told us what their ceiling was, right? We're like, okay, we were safely under it. And then they wanted less than that.
Yeah.
And another thing that, and this is just accounting, but it's huge. In the time that I've been working, like, I came from large studios, right? So starting my own business, I did consulting for a bit, and then I started Binary Bubbles, right? But even in that short period of time, I saw large companies go from billing on a 30-day cycle to a 90-day cycle, right? Which means after you deliver, right, 90 days. And you're thinking, what studio has that kind of runway?
Yeah.
That I can afford to work after, like, one of these companies literally had a project that was only 2 months long with a 90-day billing cycle. Right? And we're just like,
And,
No.
Yeah, and they wouldn't even budge for the request. Hey, let's split it like a little bit up front to cover some dev costs, and then by completion, the other 50%.
And we have an agent for that kind of work as well. So we kind of went to our agent, and our agent was basically F that.
Yeah.
Because what incentivizes them to pay you after they have everything?
Yeah.
Right.
But that's actually the state right now of work for hire in general, and what it means. And of course, that is a symptom of a much larger problem that we're seeing in all industries. But unless you're already big and established, your odds of getting that kind of revenue to keep you going are close to none.
Yeah, that kind of
it's not a business model anymore.
Yeah.
Unless you're big, unless you're as big as, let's say, Crystal Dynamics, and even they're suffering from this, right? But not in the same level as other people are. But unless you are big and established, this is not a model that will help you grow. And this is incredibly important for independent developers to understand. Because on the same token, and we can dive into this deeper if you want us to talk about that, but even selling an original property, even selling a game to a publisher has become increasingly more difficult because the bar has been set so high at this point. And it makes sense too, right? Like development costs have generally gotten cheaper. And there are a lot more developers out there. So to cut through the noise, they have raised the bar. Like, okay, now we need to see this much to even take a look at the product. So on one hand, that's fair.
You really very rarely can get by with just a GDD, right?
Absolutely.
No matter how good it is, that's very unusual now.
Yeah.
If you know someone, maybe, right? But lots of times when we hear the story like this is this amazing indie developer, and they got their product, and that's great, and that's a unicorn, and you don't hear about like the 300 people who work equally hard who did not get that, right? Because you only hear the story about the person who made it. And another thing too is lots of times when you hear about this, schools teach this now, right? So your first milestone is your school project, and that's great, but that wasn't free. That was actually the thousands of dollars of tuition that you paid to do that. And fortunately, it was, you were talented, it was good enough, and that got you the inside of the publisher. But if you're already working, right, you don't have the 6 months, 7 months, 8 months of not making money to build a demo and then shop it.
Absolutely. And just to kind of put a pin on that, but a really important thing to also remember with the big indie success stories, and I feel like this is a shout out, but be honest about why you succeeded. Because a lot of times, if you do work in the industry and you know the people, it's true, you could have made the most wonderful product in the world. You could have put all your heart and put it out there. But just looking in some game credits or reading about the history, you knew the right person. And this goes back to what I was saying about networking. Pull the strings and use your network, use your unfair advantage. Because, and I do feel that developers also need to be honest about it, the successful ones. If you know the right people, many times the reason you actually made it through wasn't that you have invested all this time alone. It's because you also had a pretty big person behind you vouching for you. And that is 50% of the reason you were even there.
It doesn't mean that the product wasn't good.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean your game wasn't a great idea. It doesn't mean you didn't work hard, but it does mean that you knew someone.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's important because that's something that indies need to know that they need to invest in.
Yeah, and that's really valuable what you're saying actually about networking. No one's spoken about that yet in our conference, and very often your network, when you are in a lean period and you're looking between contracts, if you're doing work for hire, it is your network that will come up with the goods, so and how do you go about that? We like to go a little bit deeper. Do you have a road show and go and see regularly your network, or are you always in touch? How often do you reach?
For the LA, Hollywood network, obviously that's local to us. So that's actually, that is an unfair advantage. Sometimes it's just where you live, right? And this is going to be my 25th year in games, right? So I
Listen,
have
Lisa, you don't look old enough to have 25 years.
so I have an extensive network just simply by being here a long time, right? The people that you work with, every single, and I work for large companies, right? So I work for LucasArts, and I work for 2K, and I work for, it's been like 5 years, almost 5 years in R&D with Sony, right? So, and I work for Activision. So, all of those people end up going other places, right? I know. But the perks were fantastic.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, all of those people end up going other places, right? And you keep in touch with them. And this is, and Facebook certainly helped. The rise of social networks definitely helped. Facebook, LinkedIn helps,
Yeah.
right? So,
But in addition, I mean, we do actually go out to show publishers a lot what we do, even
Yeah.
when we know that it's not necessarily relevant to them. And I think that is critical as well.
Yeah, actually, there's something that Amit really sort of like trained our team on, which was keep your network updated on new things. Even if they weren't technically looking for augmented reality or mixed reality, if you have something that you built, let them know.
Yeah.
Right? Show up. Like, hey, here's this network, and maybe you have something. And lots of times that is what happened. They don't know they want it until they see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if they don't necessarily want it, many times, everybody is dealing with the same network, and they work with other vendors as well, and with other publishers and with other developers. We've had big publishers actually refer some of their customers to us, going like, well, we don't really do what you're asking for, but this developer does. They knew that because we came in to just show them, even if it's irrelevant. So always being in touch with your entire network, like every few months, you need to keep on producing, you need to keep on showing them what you're working on, because that ends up being relevant. Even if it's not today, it could be 5 months from now, it could be 10 months from now, it could be 2 years from now. But company agendas also change.
Yeah, seriously, sometimes it was 2 years.
Yeah, sometimes it was 2 years, right? It's a relationship that you just kept on cultivating up to the point where it did become relevant. And people remember, right? You came, you were respectful, and it's a good show. If you put up a good show and show something good, they'll tell you, like, listen, we don't do this, but I mean, this is really cool.
This was hugely entertaining.
And it also means that at the point where you do have something to show that is relevant to them, they will be more likely to meet you because they're like, well, we already know you do cool stuff, right? So it's unbelievably important to attend a lot of the events like GDC, like E3, and always take the meeting. Always have something to show. Always show activity. Because another thing that a publisher has to, for their own protection, take a look at, is this a stable business? Especially if you're an indie, you're new, and most indies burn out. Very few of them actually manage to achieve growth, right? So for a publisher, it's like, this is great that you're working on, but I might want to wait another year or two to see if you even survive. And that sounds really harsh.
Yeah, but they can afford to do that.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the whole thing too. Like there's this, it's all tied together, right? If you have a network and the network's personal, that person can vouch for you internally. That helps. That buys time, right? If you don't have that, no matter how much they love you, I remember seeing this, they were talking about screenwriters, but I think it still applies, which is the no costs them nothing, right? Most things won't succeed. So the no costs them nothing, and the yes can cost them millions of dollars.
Absolutely.
So the yes is harder to get.
Yeah. So you do have to set a precedent, right? You do have to be there a lot for them to feel comfortable with you being out there and seeing that you're very active. And when people feel traction, when they see like they keep on doing these cool things, they'll eventually want in, right? Ideally, it will raise your odds over time. And I think another thing to really not question.
It also helps to have a very aggressive
I am very
biz dev.
I'm from Israel, so we have zero shame. But sometimes, even if you don't have the right contact within the company, because especially when you're dealing with big Hollywood studios, but game publishers are no different. Maybe you know for your project that you're trying to sell, but the only person you know is the person in licensing, right? They're not the person who can actually write you the check. They're not the person that you'll have to present to. But you don't know anybody else. So you have two options. One of them is, I'm going to keep on hustling, try to get the internal introduction, or you can even talk to the person that you know, no matter what position they're in, and say, hey, I want to show you something. I want to present this to you. Now, again, this is not 100% of the time, but for the most part, if they see something that's really, really cool, even if it's not part of their department, even if they're not the person to write a check, the next thing they'll say is go, this is awesome. I'm not the right person, but you should meet this guy because he's the right person. And then not only did you get your way in, you got it with a recommendation from somebody that they trust. So that is absolutely critical. If a person in marketing might say no to your project, the person in development might say yes, right? And a person who's in neither has no agenda. He will just go like, this guy didn't work, maybe you should talk to this person instead. It's critical.
And very often, if you can convince marketing, then they will convince development, right?
True.
Yeah. Clearly, marketing tends to have a set budget for the things that they do. So, and that's a spend that they're going to make anyway. So, if it may as well be on you.
Yeah.
Yeah. As their salespeople, really, if they get excited about being able to sell a product, they can very often convince development that something they can sell.
But there's also a caveat there. Like, if I take the Hollywood model as an example, like companies are much more siloed with game publishers, to the point where every department might have its own head of, a network within a network that doesn't even know who works in the building next to them. And you might have like even different marketing departments per network within a network. Like it goes everywhere. If you take that model into account, and also sometimes even if marketing gets excited, marketing plays safe. You get to marketing when you have something that they can just say, well, of course we should do this. But sometimes the way to convince marketing is to actually go through the smaller departments first, right? Traction, it's harder to get traction from the final decision maker. It's actually easier to get traction from the bottom up. When something, and this is another good lesson perhaps, sometimes showing it to multiple people within a company that are in different departments really helps as well.
You have to have the energy to do this.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been a big part of, I think, our just like learning how to be a business is we practice.
Yeah.
Right? We literally practice
your
routines a lot. So that and you check with people, because I think one of the things about working, especially with technology, is that you're used to working with people in technology. The language is very specific. Yeah. Right? That is not everyone else's language. And in the same way that, when I was in R&D, I was kind of the only non-engineer there, right? So you kind of know that no one is motivated to learn how I speak. I have to be motivated to understand how they speak. I am, outnumbered. So that's important, right? You have to motivate yourself to learn what your audience understands, right? And I think one of the things that I had to learn as well, because, I come from where I come from, was I like to explain things. Oh, you don't know what that means? Let me explain to you, how the art pipeline works. And then Meet would just be like, no one cares about that. That's just not, no one cares. Right? And so
know your audience.
Yeah, know your audience.
All of development is fascinating to me,
Yeah.
When you're in the sales process, that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it sounds like you've got not only wonderful connections, but you're also really willing to sort of go the extra mile.
It's an aggressive space, right? And they have their own protocols, and they have their own way of doing things. I still use a feeder, like a feed leaf, right? And I just read everything. like it's like an hour and a half, and it's just like, here's all the stuff that's going on in technology. Here's all the stuff that's going on in games. Here's all the stuff that's going on in Hollywood. Who moved where? What happened? Who just bought what? Right? Is this relevant to our business?
Yeah, research is unbelievable.
Yeah. Do I need to talk to someone? Should I tap into someone who, and that's people I don't even know. And then you check in with your own network as well. Did someone move? Did someone go someplace else?
Right? And it is worth mentioning, part of the reason that we are now successful, like, or we managed to get over a lot of the difficulties, is not that we actually double down on this model. It's not even all of the networking and the research and the marketing, everything that we've invested in. That wasn't what eventually put us in a safer position. What did is the fact that we were open to pivoting as a business model, and that was not easy. It's not easy to take an entire team and say, like, listen, I know that this was the model we were trying to take, but we have to take a sharp turn and we have to do it wisely, or else they will tank us, right?
Can we take a step back and maybe go to sort of what happened next then with your, you're on the second project, and then how did that go? And then how did you get to the point where you realized you needed to pivot? What happened?
So we could kind of see what was happening with, let's say, original IP, right? Because a lot of times you get into this because you have something that you want to say and something you want to do, and you have to pay attention to what the publishers are sort of telling you, right? Everyone wants to say this, but they're a business and they think like businesses, and you're kind of looking at that and you're like, all right, as with anything you do, you need to look at what can you offer, right, that other people can't. And I know that everyone wants to sit there and say, it is my, very special, unique game idea. And maybe that's it, but that's actually much, much harder to make, let's say, objectively clear that is, what you offer that no one else can. So one of the things that happened was, we are a company that has really deep technology experience, right? And that a lot of that does come from the fact that, we come from before off-the-shelf engines, right? So these pipelines, how to do custom tools, how to do all this stuff. So it was actually last GDC, right? Last GDC, we were talking to a friend, and he wanted to introduce us to someone who was a lawyer in the venture capital space, right? And basically he was like, okay, I love you guys, I think you guys are amazing, and basically come up with something that technology, come up with something right?
That I can sell.
Something I can sell, right? And we're like, okay. and we kind of went back, and that became sort of the focus. We're continuing to build our things, but it's like, okay, with our technology background, our creative background, our storytelling background, what can we create, right? And so that was the beginning of our pivot, right? We sat there and said, all right, we're going to build certain kind of interactivity into our first milestone, right? It's going to be on our own technology, but maybe it'd be fun, right? And we show that to the client, and they loved it, and they said, okay, what is this? And then we were like, it can do all this stuff. Right? and basically they went, that's a lot, and we just like this one thing, right?
Yeah,
give us can we do an example of this? And that became sort of our pivot, right? That's like, okay, it's something that sort of, it can feel like a commercial product, because it is, right? It could be very easily integrated, but it was unique technology. So so we started basically building all of our pitches in that way. Hey.
And what was this breakthrough? What was the piece of technology? Because you've gone where we were at was Spider-Man VR.
Yeah, so we're building augmented reality virtual buddies that are world aware and driven by AI, and can be controlled through a turnkey web portal. So you can essentially remote control these guys. And so all of our game designs, all of the things that we started pitching was bundled around this tech, right?
Which appealed to people in both spaces, because what it essentially means, and when we're talking about world aware, and that's what feels really magical. It's a character that the minute you turn on your TV, all of a sudden it knows what you're watching and it's responding in real time to what's actually on the screen. When you're playing a game, you can literally send it into the game and back. You develop a mutual relationship with it. And all of this is essentially puppeteered through a really easy, like the turnkey web portal, by whether it's a network or a publisher, it's whoever manages the IP itself. And the whole system is built to accommodate what they're used to.
Yeah. So we basically took everything that we knew in terms of what does a developer want to know if they have to build something for someone else? Okay, what makes things complicated? We took our knowledge of that workflow. We took our knowledge of the television network workflow, right? And their multiple businesses. How does marketing work? How does their brand management work? How does their television productions work? It's like, how do you build something that fluidly negotiates that? And then how do you use that to create this experience where, if you create something that feels good to people, right? And it's a combination of technology and art, that's the magic trick, right? That's the trade-off of you don't see when it becomes technology and when it was just an art decision and when it was a game design decision. That needs to be fluid, right?
Yeah.
And when it works, it's like, wow, how did you do that? It's like, well, at minute 5 it was this, and then minute 6 we actually just wrote a line that made you feel like this. So we really did take everything that we knew. Like we were people who had written scripts. We were people who had done animation and art, and we did know our technology. And we created something that felt very inevitable, right? Like that, natural.
Yeah,
but like
well-rounded, robust product, right?
Yeah, and what ended up happening is that it also got associated. It's not just a product; it was associated with a much longer plan, a plan for part of the technology that we could patent, a plan that actually shows more startup level growth, because we were forced to think of, okay, we're still a small business. We have to think more like a startup that can show that kind of potential. Because unlike development studios, and I think this is also maybe worth mentioning, I would always encourage independent developers to adopt certain mantras or certain philosophies that come from the startup space. And I'm not a big fan of the startup space, but there are things within that model that independent developers, because of today's economic climate, could definitely benefit from. And thinking of growth as a very...
Yeah, that was a big one for us.
That was big, right? It's the idea of how do I take this business model from chasing contract to contract, chasing I want to sell this IP, I want to sell this IP, into something that's stable, that could feed the company and make it just grow. You have a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 that is realistic, that is defensible. If you manage to do that, not only have you created a competitive advantage, but you actually have a chance to get pretty big investors interested, because that's what they're looking at. They're not looking at companies that just make money, because they know it's an unstable model, the developer model. They're looking at something can just explode, right? And there is something to be said, we're definitely somewhere in the middle on that spectrum, and that's okay. But it's because we adopted this thinking of we have to be a lot more flexible, and we have to find some competitive advantage that will eventually, and this is...
Oh, and this was a big one too. I think this is just standard business practice, right? I think when you start making money, right, it is very, very, especially if you've been living lean for a while, right, it's very, very tempting to sit there and say, hooray, we're just going to up what everyone gets. And the thing is, it's hard. You actually have to think of the money that you have to pay the company first.
Yeah.
Right? That's how you do the company. So and we're fortunate our founders are small, right? There's 3 of us. So it's very easy, okay, we're just going to take, this much money and the rest that actually goes to the company account. But that's the money you use to build the technology. That's the money you use to invest in what makes your company unique. Right? And that thing as well, because I think lots of times when people have an R&D budget, they kind of blue sky and they spin for a while, right? Because they see the money and they go oh, we can do this. It's no. Treat that like a project. Milestones,
Absolutely.
right? Have goals.
That's huge. I have seen this in independent developers before very often. If they get a big chunk of money, it's just oh, we're starving.
Yeah.
Let's take everything
Everyone
and now we keep moving
gets
forward.
10,000 this month.
That is a terrible approach.
Yeah.
very, very fast.
I've done it myself.
Yeah, I mean, people need to really, and this comes from startup, right? That is a very startup thinking. It's you stick close to burn rate until your company is powerful enough to support you. And that is a business practice, right? Like it's what Lisa was saying. The company is essentially a separate entity from you. It's its own, I always call it feed the beast first, right? And the mental switch has to be the company making money is more important than the founders making money. And once you're able to actually make that switch, that's when you can start.
Yeah, you can actually
growth.
start investing in stuff. And then I think also for me, because again, especially for games, you got into it because at least for me, I like to physically be involved in making this stuff, right? Like I learned every single part of a pipeline because I just like the tools and I like making the thing. And it's very hard for me not to like get something back and just go, oh, I'll just fix it, right? Because it's fun and I know how, right? And I think one of the things that's been really hard is delegating, right? And kind of going like, you know what, that has to be good enough because I need to be in this meeting. I need to take this other thing, like I think for me personally, just growing out of what it meant to be solid production, and what it meant to like, okay, you have to run things on a high level. And it does mean that you have to let a lot of things go that you actually liked. Right? like,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
That was hard.
You've gone from the creativity of making video games, which is why you love it so much and involved, into running a business and being responsible for the commercial aspects. I always think that, the games business is kind of spoiled by having to be commercial because it's such a wonderful playground to make stuff otherwise.
Yeah. But that's what it takes, right? Because at a
Absolutely.
certain point, you're responsible for more than just that. But yeah, it's hard, right? Because especially if you've been in the games industry for a while, you will also see the tools get better. And to me, that's like toys. Oh, the toys have gotten so much better, right? Like you don't want to bore people with how it used to be, but it used to be harder. So.
Yeah,
sure did.
Unless you're literally just a group of freelancers and that's how you view yourself. If you want to actually grow a business, you can't think of yourself as a contractor. You have to think of everything that you do as this is the business's property right now. And that also meant, and we've definitely used this strategically, even if one of our founders would get a project that literally just one person on the team can do. Like you don't need everybody, you don't need to bring in contractors to the office. Like one of us can do this because it's based on our skill sets. The way that we treated this is, okay, now this is a company project. This is something the company shows on its portfolio, and the money doesn't go to the one person who's working on it. It goes to everyone. It's back to the company account because that company has to pay for our sustainability.
You have to think of that is sort of the essence of what it means to be a team, right? And it's powerful. I think it's hard for a lot of people, and I definitely worked in situations where lots of times it's like, and I got this from an engineer, so I feel like it's okay for me to say this. Where he said lots of times when you're working with engineers, they think engineering is the only real work. Like code is the only real work. Everything else is supplemental, right? And I think like when you can take that attitude with anything that you're doing, right? Because everyone in this process has a unique skill set, especially when you're a small team, right? We have a lot of overlap in our skill sets in our team, but there's a core like specialty that everyone kind of has, right? And I think that it's so tempting for a lot of people to do the hierarchy, right? Like, okay, well, this is primarily a whatever job, therefore this person should get more of that, right? And you're, especially if you're starting and you're small, you just can't. Everyone has to be equal. You have to believe that everyone brings something to the table that's equally valuable. And that becomes empowering because even if you sit there and go like, all right, the majority of this is just me cranking away for 40 hours, right? And then everyone gets paid, but fuck that, right? But but the power of that is because you paid the company, now it's actually okay for you to sit there and say, guys, I need help with this, right? Yeah. Like, can I delegate this, and this so that I can focus on this thing, right? and everyone's getting paid. So we're like, yes, that is totally fine, right?
Yeah. And you know, using money strategically. If you know that you want to develop something, whatever profit margin you can get, because you basically put yourself, you know, with a salary of just burn rates that sustains you longer, you go, now that I have this extra money, I need to think of how to prioritize it. If I have enough to both, let's say, sustain me for two more months after this project is done, but maybe I'll cut it short by a little bit, because if I throw a little bit of money here, I can simultaneously wrap this project, which is the next thing that I'm going to sell out. It's all very high risk, but that's the thinking that constantly needs to be going on.
And that's how to sort of to bootstrap a business, you know, to think that way. And just how difficult did it get? What were the biggest challenges that you faced in making the pivot from
that 90-day pay cycle? Seriously, I was so angry. So I'm like, what the, you know, like to really see that happen, like within a year of doing, you know, taking these kinds of contracts and seeing giant companies do this, right? And then them kind of go like, oh, we can't do anything about that, right? And you kind of know, like, I know you, dude, I'm talking to, cannot do anything about this. And it's a, you know, because it's a high level decision, but it just really, it actually keeps you from taking some stuff. You just can't. You just like, I can't afford that, you know? So that I think was that, and trying to hustle so that the things lined up, that's always going to be a part of it, right? You are a small team. We've gotten, like I said, much better at delegating. Oh, much better at, and this was also a neat thing, creative partnerships, right? That if you do have a good network and you're friendly with people, that you can absolutely sit there and say, okay, let's take this project together, and that way we can both sort of benefit and sort of ride through like the next few months and do something together.
I think that was a big thing that we definitely leveraged and worked for us very, very well, where you realize even companies that are bigger than you, sometimes they want to invest in creating a project, but they don't have the bandwidth, even if they are more fortunate or bigger than you. And people tend to work together pretty well when there is a common goal. And being open, because again, there's always the thinking of like, well, if I'm doing this, I need to get paid for it. And that's a little dangerous when you're trying to invest in your own stuff, right? Because nobody's going to pay you to make your own stuff until you sell it. And to sell it, you need to have something, right? And sometimes you actually don't have the bandwidth to do it, but delaying it until you do can be a trap as well, because you might never really get to it, because there's another thing and there's another thing. So actually reaching out to other developers or to other, it's not only developers, right? We've actually done partnerships that ended up being strategically really powerful with other Hollywood studios. Like they don't have the technical expertise, but they have these characters and they have this art team and they have this, you know, customer relationship. It's being able to actually say, none of us are making money off of taking the risk of investing in this, but if we sell it together, we all win.
Yeah, we all get a portion of that.
Yeah.
So, so that is sort of what has allowed us to. It's all tied together, right? That allows us to constantly have new things that we can continue to show to networks to sell. Yeah. Right. So as we do these creative partnerships, we're sitting there going like, okay, we have something new, and we're working with these guys, and aren't they great? And you know, because you have to constantly be moving forward, and you have to constantly show that you can.
Yeah.
Right. But that, you know, all of this was a pretty sharp learning curve, and to be honest, I think Amit dragged some of us kicking and screaming.
I mean, how did you actually overcome that? You know, the 90-day cash flow issue and those difficulties.
You have to learn to say no. Honestly, like the 90-day, 2-month stuff, you're just like, I don't think that's a good risk. And perfectly honest, sometimes it's just sheer luck that something else came in right in time, and we're just like, great, now we don't have to worry about that.
But it's also how we manage funds, right? The fact that we have lowered our burn rate so that we have money flowing less but more over time meant that if you all of a sudden had, and we had like 2 months with no income, nothing coming in, those 2 months did not hurt as badly because you've been paid this whole year. enough to sustain yourself and save just a little bit.
Yeah.
And that was a critical decision that ended up paying off.
Yeah, because if you're running lean, right, and you sit there and say everyone makes, X amount less,
Yep.
right, and you go, okay, so my total savings for that was $10,000, right? That's actually a lot of office rent.
Yeah.
Right?
That is office rent that can be used for, again, a little bit that you're missing from a project that you're just trying to finish. Be very smart on how you manage your money.
Sounds like you're running a really tight ship there. That's really great. What would you recommend for indies getting into mixed reality now?
So it's a tough space because one of the things that's really different, so many rants, is that, normally when someone has new hardware, they're excited about developers. They're much more supportive in terms of like, hey, here's a dev kit. We know that we don't know our hardware is going to be great. So here's a dev kit. Please make something cool. And, they see things and they fund them, right? And I don't know if you noticed, but neither VR nor AR nor mixed reality had any of that. And I find that so strange because literally PlayStation and Xbox showed people how it was done. Right? Like, this is how you build a platform. But for some reason, hardware developers were just like, here's $50,000. And you're like, that didn't even make a game when I was starting off. Like, I don't know what kind of game you think you're going to get for $50,000. It's going to look like a game you spent $50,000 on. And sure enough, that's what it looked like, right? And everyone's like, well, this is great. But when I was thinking about VR, I wasn't thinking, look at this magical PlayStation 2 world that I can be in, right? And it's just like, you know why? Because that's how much assets cost. So I think that is challenging. People, if you're struggling and you can do it, swing it. But generally, crunch the numbers. Crunch the numbers and see if you're actually losing money on taking these, because sometimes you actually are, right? And again, it's your network, right? I think the thing that's very challenging, honestly, the way I'm looking at it, and I could be wrong, but the way I'm looking at it is, at least here, certain schools, if you come out of certain schools, that helps you a lot. USC is like this feeder school now, so a lot of teams coming out of USC are at least getting off the ground running, right? Because they have those connections. Their mentors are people in the business, and so if you're fortunate enough to have that, then sure, you have the network, hit up that network and go try and make your product, right? Do your research on your publishers. There's a few publishers that are doing very beautiful indie type games. Annapurna is the one that really comes to the forefront for me. They tend to work with a lot of established people, but they seem to take a few, people you haven't heard of. But it's not a lot, right? So like for mixed reality, it's like, try going directly to the hardware manufacturers and try and find out, like, okay, who is doing developer relations there, right? And honestly, think about what you can do for $50,000, maybe $75,000. Polish up your best idea for that, because that's sort of where funding is. You can try and do it yourself, but the user base just isn't there yet, right? So it's hard to do something that's going to sell a lot if the user base isn't there. And that's where you can look at AAA studios. You go, like, AAA studios aren't investing much in this. And why is that? And it's because they don't have to, right? They will make a lot more money by not spending the money to make this thing, right? And just supporting the primary market. And then if it takes off to the point where they have to support it, then they will. And they have the money to do that too.
Yeah.
Right? For an indie studio, you can try. And I think sometimes if you got in early and caught sort of like I almost call it the gimmick wave, right? Maybe because a lot of people are just curious. And then it just sort of dies. It's not a sustainable business model.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I do think I would also encourage indies to think a little more creatively about who their customer base is, because the tendency is to go to companies that are entertainment based, right? You want to go to the TV networks, you want to go to the game publishers, they're not necessarily
It's fun, right?
Yeah, it's fun.
And the shelf life of that is, supposed to be about 3 months anyway, at the longest.
Exactly. They're purely viewing it not even as a consumer product they monetize on. They view it as a marketing thing. Just like we did this incredible thing now everybody knows.
Yeah. So it's a good way to if you're interested in this space and for indies in this space to get essentially funded development so they can sort of explore it. But I feel like, again, unless you came out during the first few weeks of something, right, with this kind of stuff, and you're like one of the 20 things that are worth looking at, it's really hard to gain traction after that, right? Like I think early VR, a lot of people were like, and you bought everything because that was the 20 things that were worth buying. And then now the store is flooded and you can't tell the difference between shovelware and good stuff, and it's still kind of expensive. so you're like, I don't know, I don't feel like spending $20 for this, right? And I think AR is kind of there as well, and you really do have to look at the user base number and go like, are there enough users there? And that there just isn't, right? Yeah. Like if you're an indie and you go, I got limited funds, unless you really want to do this space. I mean, this is just as a business. You love it, and you really, then do what you want to do. And but as a business, make a kick-ass game that more people can play. Yeah. like just do that.
Yeah, and I would say, and I know this is not a popular philosophy in the indie space, but I would really encourage people to adopt it. Use self-publishing only as a last resort, especially in your first projects. Like, it is a huge mistake to think that you will put something as wonderful as it can be out on a store and people are just gonna go for it. They're not.
It's a fluke when it happens. It's great.
It's a unicorn.
I love those stories too, but really a business is all about maximizing your chances of success.
Yeah, and your first goal should always be name recognition, because even a developer that can afford to self-publish and still get traction is a developer that already has a recognizable brand. It means that people go, oh, a new game from this developer that I absolutely love because I know them from the last game. That would work. If you're somebody completely new, it's the equivalent of winning the lottery. Now, and people think, okay, VR doesn't have a lot of content, so if I put something out there, people will just consume it. But there isn't a big customer base, and people aren't checking into VR as often as they hope.
Yeah, like my first year with everything that I had, I checked it a lot, and I can't. When was the last time I checked it? It's been a while.
Yeah, right? Yeah, and that means that even though you're supposed to have that advantage, it's no longer an advantage. The only things that are being played or are getting some traction are, if you're doing a port for Skyrim, people are gonna check it out. But if it's just an indie game, not very likely. So I would advise any developers that whatever your first thing, the first thing that you put out there, if you can get it backed by either a brand or a publisher, a known license,
someone that has a marketing budget is what we're saying.
Even though this is not the ideal way to make large profit, getting your name out there, getting your brand out there is
having something to show.
Yeah, having something to show, the most critical first step, because that's validation for everybody else that follows.
Thank you. I think you could have saved a lot of independent developers a lot of headache with what you shared with us there. Where are you heading now with your studio and with your product? What are your plans, short and medium term?
So we are basically a startup, right? So we are meeting with investors and accelerator groups, as well as customers now. So we basically have 2 tracks running, right? Because we are gaining customers for the product that we're building, and that's been super fun. We got to a point just end of last year, beginning of this year, where we actually had the demo working, and that's why we could sort of start showing it, right? So we're lining up interested customers for that, and at the same time getting traction in the investment space to kind of like build this to the next phase. So that's where we are.
Yeah, and then the next phase is essentially like our company is right now turning from a development studio gradually into something that's more of a software as a service, because even though we are producing this as a product right now, eventually this is going to be a very powerful platform.
Yeah. So we're building a system, right?
Yeah, we're building an entire system.
So
with that system, what is the future that you see? How do you envisage this market panning out that will allow for this system to proliferate?
We're building a system so that anyone can essentially remote control, right, through a web portal, a digital character, right? So you think about all of the applications of that, right? If you're a television studio, if you're a brand manager, if you are even a hobbyist, you want that out there, that you can sit there and say, okay, anyone who has my character, whether they're in mixed reality, whether they're in AR, whether they're VR, or even a standard game, if I sit there and go, like, every single person who's interacting with my character now, I want that character to be sad, right? And I push out sad, and every character just gets depressed. What am I using that for? It's like,
That's fantastic.
So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, because we realized that, especially because we're leveraging original IP, we're leveraging existing characters that people already have an emotional connection to. These characters become celebrity spokespeople, right?
So one of the things that we realize is, everyone who loves, a SpongeBob character, who loves, Mickey Mouse, right? That is a one-way relationship, right? You love them. You don't really get a strong sense that they love you back unless you go to Disneyland, and then they love you for like the 3 hours after you waited to meet them. So we're like, okay, that's what technology is so good at, right? If you use technology and storytelling and animation correctly, right, you can feel like you met someone, right? And that is powerful. So that's sort of the direction we're heading. So we still get to use all the stuff we like, but it's different, right? It's a different way of thinking about what we know how to do.
Well, it sounds really awesome, and I'm so pleased to have had this chat with you today. You've given so much insight for our audience. I really appreciate it. Do you have any sort of final pieces of advice or for developers, or top 3 lessons learned or guidelines that you might share?
Pay attention to the larger industry, right? Do your research. It's so tempting to just sit there and say, head down, I'm going to focus on my task, and it's going to work out because that's the story we love. But actually pay attention to everything else that's going on around you, because that you're not operating in a vacuum, right? So that's one. Do you have one?
Yeah, think of yourself as a business, not as a contractor. Think of long-term goals. It's never about, even if you make the most wonderful game and you get a publishing deal, if you get to release this game and you don't know what the next thing is that you're doing, if it's not already in development and in your back pocket, you're already behind.
Yeah. And then what's the last
And
one?
think of growth. Think of strategy. Be very willing to pivot.
And I think that's so much of it. Like, be open to your job changing.
Yeah.
Like, be open to what are you actually good at, right? This is just a general career thing, right? But what are you actually good at? Like, you might have I started off saying I want to be an animator, and that's all I wanted, by the way. Like, that was like the end. And I want to be an animator. That's it, right? And along the way, it's like, but I'm very good at technology, and I'm a very good art tech, and I understand engineering, and I think, like, it's an opportunity, and but you mourn a little bit, right? Because there's how you thought of yourself and what you end up doing. But that happens. If you want to have a career, right, you gotta let that happen.
And the wonderful thing in this business is there's room for about 4 careers while you're over there.
Yeah.
And on the same note, teams have to work together, but there has to be an actual hierarchy, and there has to be delegation of roles that has to be pretty strict. Having good leaders matters, right? having somebody who deals with business development that knows what he's doing matters. And for other team members to respect those boundaries. Like with our team, we have very, very strict rules. Like when our CTO says engineering-wise we shouldn't do something, he gets final say.
Yeah.
Right?
And, yeah, and I think the hierarchy, lots of times I think sometimes people think of hierarchy as like, I am more important than you here.
Yeah, and it's not that.
And then, I think Valve did the thing. It's like, no, a hierarchy's flat. And then that gets super confusing. And I think it's a little bit more like, I feel like the best startups I've sort of worked in is literally, you think of everyone like this, and your job title just defines what your role is.
Yeah.
Right? You're not more important. It just tells you, like, when something goes wrong, is that your fault or is it someone else's job to take care of?
And having authority over a certain domain. I mean, a CEO should make these kinds of calls. A business development person has final say in these kind of calls. Like having that kind of division is extremely important. You still have to listen to each other, right? Because you might make your technical person change its mind if you use the right argument. But in the end of the day, he has the veto, and that is critical.
Yeah, and that is mutual respect, right? You have to have respect.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. There's something else I love about your business as well. The size of your idea is huge. It really could be a disruptor, which is very exciting. So thank you for sharing with us about that too.